The 2000 U.S. presidential election was notable for its relatively lackluster set of key issues surrounding tax cuts and Social Security reform. The events afterwards, however, were anything but insubstantial, as America plunged headlong into its war on terror during the Bush administration, raising questions regarding how Al Gore may have responded differently to 9/11. But the election itself, having been won by an extremely thin margin and triggering a Florida recount where voting irregularities were discovered, became one of the most hotly contested in U.S. history. In the words of the movie Recount, reflecting upon their laws, Democratic strategists contemplate the seemingly mundane events that substantially influence history. Ralph Nader should have had his head out of his ass. Elian Gonzalez should have never left Miami. Gore should have campaigned with Clinton, and Clinton should have gotten caught getting a blowjob by Sharon Stone instead of Monica Lewinsky, because his approval ratings would have shot through the roof. Katherine Harris should have thought twice about purging 20,000 voters from the rolls, and George Bush Jr. should have never quit drinking. But the real question is, would the Supreme Court have ruled the same way if Bush had called for a recount?
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
The military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been time to be a
на полный разгром гнусных захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century. I am Hank Oslo, and with me tonight are Adam Smith.
Hey.
And Hans Lander.
Hello.
And, before we get started, we'd like to thank our donors. Nick, unfortunately, couldn't be here tonight as we're recording on a slightly different schedule than usual, but we did want to mention our first non-human donation of $10 from a listener who goes by Doggo. We believe him to be a very good boy. We're actually planning on some dog-friendly content in the future. So, in Florida on election night of November 7th, 2000, a razor-thin margin for George W. Bush initiated one of the defining political struggles of the 2000s, as dueling court decisions, a massive media campaign, obscure county officials, and a horde of political operatives battled for the greatest political prize on the North American continent. Bush's ultimate victory in the courts and Florida's legislature resulted in a presidency that was forever tainted by questions of fundamental legitimacy and left a larger political system grappling with the question of judicial supremacy over what claims to be a democracy. So we'd like you to crank up the Smash Mouth and dust off your No Blood for Oil bumper stickers because we're going to be talking about the 2000 Florida recount. So, we had mentioned how election night, Florida, November 7th, 2000, the results were sort of immediately unclear. There's a lot of great archival footage on YouTube that shows things directly as they happened. And there's actually a fantastic film directed by Jay Roach of Austin Powers fame called Recount, that layers in a lot of archival footage, especially from various newscasts, and is actually fairly accurate for what it is. Also has great performances by Kevin Spacey and Laura Dern. The AP, the Associated Press polling service, called Florida for Gore after most of the polls closed. Not all of them, because you have the part of the panhandle in a slightly different time zone. Within a few hours, they revise their call and call it to Bush, and then a third time decide to call it as too close to call. By this point, it's apparent that the margin of victory is going to be within the amount that triggers an automated machine recount. And Gore, having previously conceded by telephone to Bush, retracts his concession. Officially, as of the tally on election night, Bush was in the lead by 1,784 votes. This is on the 7th, or the night of the 7th. The automatic machine recount, where they literally just feed the votes back through the same machines that counted them the first time, reduces this to 900 votes, effectively halving the margin. This should be your first clue that something is screwy, when literally just recounting the ballots without any alterations in standards ends up screwing with the margin by a factor of half. And within a couple of days, by about the 10th, it becomes clear that this is going to be a political struggle. Everyone is hiring people like crazy, flying people into Florida. Gore ends up hiring former Clinton Secretary of State Warren Christopher, and the Bush campaign decides to bring in Satan himself in the guise of James Baker III, an extremely competent fix-it man, essentially, through the Reagan and Bush the First presidencies,
and also former Secretary of State.
Correct. Yeah, and chief of staff at one point as well. He's also been an ambassador, a bunch of prominent positions.
Did he work in the private sector before he did that, or was it afterwards? Because I think he was on the board of like the Carlyle Group or one of these big private equity with military contracts.
I'm sure he got paid somehow at some point. Most of these guys, they sort of do a stint. This is one of the themes that when you're out of power, your party just kind of puts you on ice, but they still give you something to do as long as you're sufficiently prominent. So usually you take your time sort of in the cooler to get paid off by all the people that you did favors for while you were in office.
Also fits with the trend of Bush family friends having ties to either Carlyle Group or some private military corporation or aerospace company. So either Halliburton, K&R, Carlyle Group, Boeing, so on.
Yeah, those are always best friends of anybody who's in government, because, of course, they control the flow of funds to those companies almost exclusively. So Gore essentially initiates, because he is the person who needs to make a change happen, he chooses a very interesting tactic. He requests a selective recount of 4 strong blue counties, Miami-Dade, Broward, Fort Lauderdale, and something else, I believe, on the 11th. These recounts are conducted by the county officials. There's usually a county canvassing board that is usually just kind of whoever signs up for the job. It's a lot of cat ladies, political apparatchiks that don't have the gumption for anything more high-powered. But it is political local county officials in deep blue counties. So the expectation is that, oh, surprise, surprise, when we take a second look at it, we magically discover that a lot of these ballots that previously had been malformed or had voted multiple candidates or hadn't voted for any candidates, we magically discover that a lot of these, when you look at it in the right light, are Gore votes. So the expectation is that this pads out his total and maybe gets him over the threshold to where he can have a lead in county-by-county results by the time the election is certified. So they begin recounting more or less of their own initiative because the local counties do have a lot of authority in managing their own elections. But it becomes clear that they're going to blow through the deadline that they usually have of certifying a week from the election. on the 14th. So the Gore campaign also sues in state court on the 14th to have this deadline extended. So it's pretty clear what's going on here. If you're an outside observer, you are behind, so you try to pick the juiciest target for your local political machine to try to gin up some votes. Like, this happens all over the place. There's stories like out of the Minnesota Senate campaign that elected Al Franken, of discovering hundreds of ballots in the trunk of a car mysteriously just appeared there.
Weren't they like ex-cons or something?
Yeah.
Yeah,
there were about 1,000 ex-cons that voted in that election, and Franken won by about 300 votes.
Right. And ex-cons are not a staunchly conservative demographic, desires of the National Review notwithstanding. So, almost simultaneously with the initial Gore suit, on the 11th, the Bush campaign does the legal equivalent of calling bullshit. They sue also in state court to stop the manual recount. They have several rounds for doing this, but they almost don't matter. The gist of their arguments in kind of policy terms that the Gore campaign is attempting to treat some counties differently than others. They haven't followed the correct procedures. There's no authority for a recount. You're trying to make these votes count, but not these other ones. Basically, the sum total of all of these arguments is it's not fair, which is, needless to say, not a standard that has any real independent way that you can decide if things are behaving properly.
Mm-hmm. On the subject of the four counties, the four Democratic counties that they pursued, I saw an interview or partial interview as part of a documentary with Donna Brazile, the more recently disgraced head of the DNC. And she commented that the Democratic strategy at the time, for legal reasons and just for pure strategic reasons, was to go back to these counties, turn out as many votes as they could from the recount, and then try and get a state or get enough votes to flip the state effectively, even if it meant just by getting it by one vote.
Yeah,
and then exactly. they had Bob Beckel working on the ground, trying to convince the members of the Electoral College in Florida that, statistically speaking, Gore actually won, and that they should flip their votes because it's only a matter of time until it's proven that Bush did not win the state, and so on and so forth. Like there were several little campaigns both on the recount side and on the back end to try and take the election towards the Democrats.
Yeah, the movie Recount explores this dynamic really well. Of you're some church lady in rural Florida, and suddenly fricking James Baker is flying in with 200 people to sue the shit out of you personally. It's kind of a system shock that a lot of these people were not really prepared for, and it resulted in some pretty funny behavior, particularly on the part of people like, I'm probably going to say Kamala Harris a bunch of times tonight. But
I kept wanting to say that too. It's funny, yeah. I don't know who's Pamela Harris. Is she somebody famous?
Kamala Harris is the senator of California.
Oh, Kamala.
She's our illustrious 46th president to be.
Yeah, the mulatto brown beauty. But the funny thing is that
Katherine Harris.
Yeah.
So Katherine Harris is the Florida Secretary of State. We were talking about this a little bit pre-show. In national context, the Secretary of State basically does foreign affairs. On a state level, your Secretary of State is kind of like board of the notaries almost. They usually do things like certifying elections, which is where she comes in this context. They do corporate registrations. They manage deeds a lot of the times, keeping track of titles and mortgages and things. Basically records.
Should also be mentioned that she was a Republican, and the governor of Florida at the time was Jeb Bush, the brother of George Bush, the son of George Herbert Walker Bush, and the state assembly of Florida was also majority Republican, if I'm correct.
That's right, but the Florida Supreme Court, interestingly enough, because they had de facto, if not de jure, lifetime appointments, most of them had been appointed back when Florida was a conservative Southern Democratic state before the Gingrich Revolution of 94. So the state Supreme Court was actually still run by Democrats.
It's really amazing, just like hearing all this, how much influence these small groups or individuals, in many cases, have over the election, which is supposed to be for everyone, right? But the reality is, especially when you have such a close call like this, the levers of power get thrown into gear with full force, and you see the biases inherent in each individual cog in the machine starting to influence the outcome pretty heavily, and on both sides. You could see, the bias and the arguments they were making. I mean, to me, it's like, okay, clearly there's some problems with these vote tabulations. So simple, let's just do it again with a simple standard. But of course, you can't do that. Of course, there's a million legal reasons that they'll throw at you for not being able to do that. But if you just truly want to be democratic, we need to know what people want. And they have to complicate it so much because everybody's basically just trying to get their way. They're not trying to do it.
Yeah, it's actually even worse than that. There's no way that you can get. This is probably a good time to talk about the elderly Jewish Pat Buchanan demographic. You had this situation, especially in Palm Beach, where they were using ballot designs that they thought were confusing. They being the nice old, nearly blind, nearly senile, retired old Jewish lady demographic of the area.
The butterfly ballot.
The butterfly ballot, the dreaded
Palm
butterfly
County, right?
ballot. Right. So you can look up pictures. I'm not going to try to describe it with my words. It looks straightforward to me, but
I think it's a stupid design. But yeah, I mean, if you're not smart enough to figure that out, you shouldn't be voting. I mean, it's
Here's the thing, though. That ballot was designed and approved by a Democratic elections director in Palm County.
Right. And it was actually, they did that layout to make the font about 3 times larger than the adjacent county's ballots so that their elderly blind voters could actually see the names on the thing.
Yeah, so the argument is it's on a tilt when you're actually in the voting booth, and so if you're looking at it at an angle, it looks like if you picked Al Gore, you're picking Pat Buchanan. But I'm looking at it straight down, and I'm like, well, Pat Buchanan's right in between Bush and Gore, so it should be just random which one you pick if you're not able to follow instructions. But they're like, no, it's at an angle, and so therefore it'll skew to Buchanan or instead of Gore.
You will never design a system that is capable of handling that many people of that limited abilities in a way that gives you to a precision. I mean, we're talking about like a 0.3%, I believe, margin.
Yeah.
The error rate, if you just have like college students doing some information entry task where they're just copying something from one place to another, you're looking at about a 2% error rate. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, to demand a 0.3% error rate for somebody who's old and blind and maybe not that sharp to begin with, it's just not practical to say that we're going to condition the sort of running of our system on making this as accurate of a sample as possible. And even more to the point, it doesn't really matter if it is an accurate reflection of their preferences. Because the whole point of an election is that it is basically a proxy. It's what you do instead of having a war. Instead of everybody lines up their guys and you fight and a bunch of people die on the side with more people wins.
Yeah, but
you line up your guys and you count, and then you all agree to be friends.
That's true, but it's not helpful if it's not clear who's the winner. So this is why it shouldn't be confusing.
But this is why simple. This is why ideally you want, and the courts and legislatures are set up to prioritize this as well. The thing that you want more than anything else is clarity, not accuracy. You want a standard, you enforce it. Some people get screwed, but you knew that going into it, and have a clear outcome that reflects the sort of the reified preferences of the system.
Well, to Adam, or I guess to both your points, if you don't have an election, you get violence. We've had some pretty nasty elections in U.S. history. This is a pretty good black pill to take on, I guess, the standard history you're given for presidential elections, or that weird elections are a new thing. Yeah, you had the John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson, and then Thomas Jefferson versus Aaron Burr election, where John Adams essentially said that a civil war was expected, given the way that the election was turning out between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. And then John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson, and then Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel Tilden, which is kind of weird, but you had angry Democratic mobs across the country, like hundreds of thousands of people, screaming Tilden or blood, Tilden or blood, Tilden or blood, and threatening to go to D.C. and put a nice musket ball in Rutherford B. Hayes because they expected different results.
Yeah, you also had the
resolved
1960 election, which was pretty much everybody agrees that was fraudulently won by Kennedy with the assistance of a bunch of dead folks voting in Chicago. And I mean, let's not forget the big one, the 1860 election, where you had literally the election of a candidate that a significant minority of the country found unacceptable, where they worried they would be closed out of power for the foreseeable future, literally resulted in a civil war.
Yeah.
So the notion of America as a inherently stable polity where we just vote and, well, that's how it shakes out and we all go home is not accurate. Things can go very far south very quickly. And actually, the fact that things can go south is one of the things that helps keep the system honest. You set up the system so that however you're voting and counting is an actual reflection of the underlying power dynamics. And then ideally, you don't have to let those power dynamics reify and actually fight.
Right.
So by this point, there's already a couple of lawsuits, at least, in state courts. But there is a federal lawsuit as well, where Bush is requesting of the federal courts to halt the selective recount. The federal district court refuses to give an injunction to stop the recount on the 13th, a day before the putative or the prospective certification deadline. Meanwhile, on the state side, you almost need a flowchart, but not quite, for this entire flowchart of competing court cases. But on the state side, the state lower court says that the counties can certify the result, and Katherine Harris drops in to demand that counties, in fact, certify or give reasons for not certifying by the deadline.
Did you say hair drops? Because she apparently was like a very big beauty queen type.
Yeah, she was a snappy dresser. She was also a an ardent Zionist who liked to compare herself to Queen Esther.
She was also the co-chair for the Bush campaign.
Right.
People don't always remember that.
She later ran for senator from Florida, I believe, and lost by an enormous margin.
She was
a
hated
Republican in Florida. I think she's led a somewhat quiet life since that particular defeat.
Yeah.
So she demands that they certify, but the Florida Supreme Court, which is, as you'll recall, run by legacy conservative Democrats, by this point has had enough appeals work up the chain to them that they're able to rule on November 15th that the recounts can proceed in blue counties, but they defer the decision on whether those recounted numbers actually need to be included in the final tally. So we're left in a situation where the can has been kicked down the road. There are recounts proceeding in these 4 Democrat-heavy counties. There's a bunch of balls in the air at various points in the courts. The election hasn't been certified yet. Everything is just sort of latent. This is where stuff starts to get pretty real the next 15 days or so. On November 17th, Miami-Dade County begins their manual recount, and a couple of days later, you have a hilarious incident where, amongst other people, Roger Stone and a couple hundred political operatives flown and bussed in from other states basically stage a riot when the Miami-Dade County Canvassing Board decides they're going to grab 10,000 ballots and go into a private room, very, very legit scene, to count the undervotes, to see if maybe they can talmudically discern in this blank sheet of paper whether there was a metaphysical intention of voting for Al Gore. So the staffers actually do start a riot. They are tossing over furniture. They break a couple of windows. They basically scare the crap out of these county commissioners, who decide a couple of days later that maybe this recount wasn't such a great idea and vote to suspend the whole thing. So this is some Banana Republic tier shit.
Well, they called it the Brooks Brothers riot because of the standard boat shoe wearing Republican, young college Republican kind of showing up. And then in that movie, Recount, Dennis Leary had like the best lines. He basically said they flew in these congressional aides in the Enron jet, which is pretty funny.
Enron, man. Enron bought the election, commander and thief.
Only Bush saved Enron. Wouldn't that been something?
Oh, man. 90s and early 2000 nostalgia, just at the cusp of September 11th. It's remarkable how high the passions went, how
over
low
so little
the stakes were.
Yeah, exactly.
Because let's put on our time machine and go back to the actual election campaign, where you had 2 fundamentally identical neoliberal stamp of approval, open borders, world government candidates who were running on very minor technocratic differences on tax policy, social security.
Well, in the words of SNL's presidential parody debate, it came down to 2 things: lockbox and strategery. And everybody's like, what? What are we arguing about?
Don't forget the sighing.
Yeah.
The raw pointlessness of the actual choice that was presented. It's difficult to believe from our perspective now that you could really be dead set on like Bush versus Gore. This is a transformative moment for the American political system. Mostly it seemed to be just about, who got jobs. Like, if you worked on the campaign, you want a job. So when the shit hits the fan in Florida and the guy running your campaign office in Ohio or whatever sends a bus for you and all your buddies to go down there and stir up some shit.
Oh, you know what it was? Yeah, it was so surreal compared to today, because what the debate was about was how to spend the surplus in the U.S. budget. It was like, and Gore was like, I'm gonna hide it away in a lockbox and save Social Security, and Bush was like, nah, just make a tax cut. That was basically the debate. It was like, how do you spend the surplus? And we're like, can't even imagine.
Whatever will we do with this enormous pile of money?
It wasn't even that much. Like, it was a very small surplus. It was effectively nothing.
Yeah, I mean, the projections, though. It's important that you spend your projected surplus before anyone can commit to it actually showing.
Yeah.
The best thing to buy with that would be a series of endless wars.
Yes. So I guess the counterfactual here to talk about is, would any of this have mattered? Like, would Gore still have dealt with 9/11 the same way Bush did?
Probably. I mean, he was pretty co-opted by neocons himself. Like, let's not forget that what was the 1996 it was like the Iraq Regime Change Act or something. It was like a 90s piece of legislation.
Yeah, no, there was a guy.
The U.S. Congress was like,
forward.
yeah, our policy is to overthrow the government of Iraq.
It might have been James Bamford or somebody, but he wrote a bunch of books about the NSA, and he was on one of these talk shows after 9/11, and there's stuff on, God, I think like Charlie Rose interviewed him in '85. It's insane. And he was talking about how in the 90s they were trying to get this stuff, basically like what you just said, like, how do we get rid of Iraq? And they couldn't get the congressional, or basically Clinton said, okay, then if we invade, then what? And then the answer was not politically appealing to him. So he said, no, let's not do that. And they couldn't get the approval until the next president came in, which was Bush in this case. But they've been trying this thing for years. And it was this, whoever it may be, I mean, you can get conspiratorial about 9/11 if you want, but basically the neocons essentially were involved in all of this stuff, it seems. And they were the ones pushing for it.
Bill Kristol and like the Center for a New America, or the New American Century Foundation.
Project for a New American Century.
Right. That would have still been active if Gore was around. Probably would have been more active because the fingers would have only ever been pointed at the DNC, never at Bill Kristol and his little group of scheming Jews.
And you don't even need to plumb that deep for the counterfactual, because you can look at exactly what happened when Obama was elected.
Right.
Where he was elected specifically on the platform of actively disavowing the Bush foreign policy, and then proceeded to do the exact same thing. So without even that kind of fig leaf of wanting to oppose those projects, I think it's pretty likely that Al Gore would have been, George W. Bush with yet to lower charisma. So
Roger Stone breaks up the recount or something.
Yeah, so Roger Stone, I can't believe he doesn't have like a painting of this in his house. Maybe he does. I've never been to his house.
He has a tattoo of Nixon on his back, so
shirtless and wielding a baseball bat and physically removing the ballots from Democrats, the county office. So they shut down that particular recount, but you still have three other recounts proceeding apace. And on November 17th, the state Supreme Court rules that Harris a state court rules that Harris can certify the result and end this grotesque charade. However, immediately the Florida Supreme Court steps in and says, don't do that. We're staying that decision. Don't certify yet. you'll see this kind of bouncing back and forth as courts kind of intrude on each other's spheres. They issue rulings. Those rulings are immediately stayed, or injunctions are issued, and injunctions are immediately stayed. It's really bizarre to watch the system try to deal with something where there actually is a hard deadline, because normally this number of court cases would take literally about a decade to kind of wind their way up and down and wait for each other to wait for all the appeals and the can't pronounce the word, but the appeals that happen in the middle of proceedings to go up and down. To see it all happen over the course of what ends up being 36 days from beginning to end, where you have literally dozens of court decisions in that time frame, it's unprecedented. It's not what the system was designed to handle, and it's not really surprising that the end result ended up being a clusterfuck that significantly diminished the prestige of the judiciary as a whole. It's nightmare speed. It's pushing the system far, far beyond almost the physical constraints that it can handle. So they further rule 5 days later on the 21st that, okay, your 4-county manual recount, it has to be included in the total. Basically, we're going to stick with the Gore plan. You get your recount, you get your selective recount, you get to see what you can gin up in the local county election offices. And Katherine Harris is prevented from certifying the results until November 26th, when the recount is presumably concluded. So they don't actually have enough votes on the 26th to win the election for Gore. So at this point, Bush is still in the lead by 600 or so votes. So Katherine Harris certifies the results. The show should be over at this point, except for the Gore campaign sues again in state court to prevent them from certifying. And here is where things get really weird, because it's clear at this point, like, there's not enough juice in these counties. They can't get blood from a stone. If you restrict it to these counties, there's not going to be a Gore victory. The numbers don't add up. So after a series of appeals of the Gore request to prevent certification, on December 8th, the Florida Supreme Court does what nobody had actually asked them to do, and mandates a full statewide recount, but only of undervotes, where there was no underlying ballot recorded for the presidential race.
So
you
just
can see
to confirm with you, an undervote was basically like one of these, for example, ballots that had one of these hanging chads, or something that made it unclear what the voter intended, so they basically just didn't count it either way. Is that right? Correct.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you have three classes of things. You have a normal vote for president, where you choose one candidate, the system picks it up, everything is good. You have an undervote, where for whatever reason the machine doesn't pick up the result because it's an optical scanner and you didn't fill in the bubble enough. It's a punch card, and the Chad, this little piece of paper, wasn't punched cleanly through. You also have overvotes, where this is what happened a lot in Palm Beach, I guess, where they would vote for both Buchanan and Gore. So you're recording 2 votes. You don't get to vote twice, no matter how special you are, so your ballot is discarded for that race. So you can see what's happening here, though. The fact that it's a full statewide recount after the maximum request of the Gore campaign failed to achieve victory, but you're only counting undervotes, most of those undervotes you would expect to go to Gore. Because, let's not forget, the Democratic electorate, especially in Florida, is significantly less capable than the Republican demographic. So if you're intricately inspecting every ballot for any plausible way that it can have a mark recorded, you're going to expect that you're going to pick up a surplus of Democratic votes. And this kind of gives lie to the notion of, all we want is an accurate count, because there's no way that this would be occurring if the result was the opposite way. And this is not something that's done under normal circumstance. It's an extraordinary remedy that you kind of pull out like a rabbit out of a hat as your trump card, so to speak, when you're far enough behind that you might actually be able to rig this sucker.
Mm-hmm. And those are all Jim Baker's points. Like, you can find footage on YouTube, and he's giving a press conference. I think it was recorded by C-SPAN, essentially saying, well, if they want to count every vote, let's count every vote. Let's do a full statewide recount. Let's spend the resources. We're up for that. Because I think
that was itself tactical, because there's a hard deadline in the Constitution of the Electoral College meeting on December 14th or so. I think the 14th, because a full recount would take too much time. You would blow through that. The sort of surplus per recounted vote under those circumstances for Gore, you would expect to be much less, because you're going to be primarily just validating the results of the initial count, the initial vote, which, again, is theoretically the point of a recount. So it's the same dynamic where there's an underlying legal or moral point, but the choice of which point to make is clearly tactical. If it had come out the other way, no, we don't need to count everything.
Right.
We need to toss these suckers, like, screw these old ladies, etc. So this full statewide recount is immediately appealed to, I'm not sure if that was appealed to a federal intermediate court, or if they simply file directly with the Supreme Court, as one does when one is suing a state. But regardless, Bush appeals this, and it ends up at the Supreme Court. So simultaneously, there's a series of machinations in the Florida legislature where, at this point, you have 2 weeks to get this all settled. And depending on how things shake out in the courts, again, like, a court decision takes just a day or two to write, just because you don't want to at least give the impression that you're trying to make it look correct. So if you have a series of recounts and communications and court decisions, and you still haven't certified the result, one of the posited scenarios was actually that Florida wouldn't have any electoral votes be counted at that time, and the whole thing would go to the House of Representatives, which would have been interesting from a poli-sci perspective, but probably a pretty terrible idea.
And then doesn't Gore have some sort of like tiebreaker role?
Yeah, so there was also, at this point, I don't believe the Senate was 50-50. The House, and it doesn't matter anyway, because the rule is that the House of Representatives does an alternate voting thing where every state delegation gets one vote, and they choose between the top 2 candidates. Even at the time, there were more red states than blue states, so that would have also resulted in a Bush victory, probably. But the Florida legislature, see, nobody saw this coming. Like, this is the result of a series of decisions that kind of assume that things won't actually be razor sharp, high precision outcomes being needed.
Mm-hmm.
Like, usually somebody wins the election. There's probably tens of thousands of elected positions in the U.S., and very few of them are actually credibly contested. The U.S. House of Representatives has lower turnover than the Soviet Politburo did. So most of the time, it's like somebody wins by 1, 2, 5, 20%, and everything's gravy. It's only in the context of an election where nobody really gives a shit about the merits that you see this kind of like 100-vote margin over an entire state play out. It's kind of a freakish occasion.
Both candidates were so boring. No one could decide.
Well, also keep in mind that so the basis of this system was set up in a time where if this sort of constitutional crisis ever came to a head, it was expected that they would just have a gentleman's discussion about how to resolve it, which is effectively which is what happened with those two early election problems I cited, the 1800 and 1824 election cycles. Yeah, Hamilton or Thomas Jefferson and Burr and John Adams, and then John Quincy Adams and Jackson. Those were all kind of just resolved by the men and their posses, effectively. Like, okay, here's how this is going to work out. Or this is how we're going to avoid.
And their pistol.
Yeah, I mean, there was that threat. I think at one point, because Henry Clay was involved in this this dispute between Adams and Jackson. Jackson threatened to have Henry Clay shot and then hanged from a lamppost in D.C. for good shenanigans. Yeah, so there were threats traded back and forth, but it was expected that people would just work things out. It was never, the United States was never expected to be this giant. I mean, what was the population in 2000? At least 250 million people spread out across 3,000 plus miles. Like, it was never conceived of that much hanging in the balance of what was originally intended to be a very limited scope role, the President of the United States.
And then the notion of just that many people voting been foreign to them. Like, what, you're letting your country, the choice of the ruler of the greatest military power the world has ever seen, be decided by the fields of elderly Jewish widows.
Right.
That's some mandate of heaven there you got.
They did never, constitutional law prior to, I want to say, World War II, and maybe even just the 20th century, never had the president contain that much power. And certainly Congress played a more active role in deciding what the military did. But if you told the early founders, or even some of the later founders, or even Civil War politicians, like, yeah, we're going to set up a system where the president can just write his own laws with executive orders, has the War Powers Act, and controls a massive military with 10 giant superboats and thousands of nuclear weapons, and people get to choose who gets to have that role.
You've been like, you're insane. You need to correct this. Something really bad is going to happen, guys. We're pretty sure we know how this ends.
Right.
So now things lie at the Supreme Court, and you get this lovely spectacle of 9 people who are literally dressed like priests, deciding if they can discern from the holy books of the Constitution, and by discerning the sort of slaughtered goat entrails of the metaphysical will of the people, who should be the next emperor. And I'm really only caricaturing this a tiny bit. This is, I don't want to don whatever tie color NRX is, but once you realize they're literally dressed as priests, and Anthony Kennedy is talking about fundamental values, and they're interpreting Holy Writ that hasn't changed in decades out of any plausible contexts, you can't really unsee the comparison to literal priests. So they confer, and on December 9th, they don't issue a decision. They issue an emergency stay, preventing the statewide manual recount from proceeding. So this is, a lot of these Supreme Court machinations are the subject of Bugliosi's book, Outrage, Vincent Bugliosi, the Manson prosecutor, which is adapted from an article in The Nation with the catchy title, None Dare Call It Treason, where he lays out basically the democratic arguments against the Bush versus Gore decision fairly cogently, with a lot of rhetorical padding and blustering and claims to his own personal moral authority and what have you. But it's a brisk enough read that it will capture the essence of their arguments. And they're right that the normal standard for issuing a injunction or a stay of a lower court ruling is that if you allow this ruling to go forward, the person who is appealing is going to suffer irreparable harm and that they have a decent chance of winning. So you have to ask, what's the irreparable harm that is caused to Bush from allowing a recount to proceed? And they phrase it as it's damaging to his legitimacy, which is kind of a terrible argument because it should be damaging to his legitimacy if he, in fact, doesn't have any legitimacy because he lost the election. They can't actually come out and say, well, you know, the other side is playing hardball trying to gin up some votes where they weren't able to get them according to normal rules. So we're shutting it down and, you know, our guy gets the win. So instead they phrase it in these terms of, you know, well, you know, this is getting out of control. We can't have the spectacle of an illegitimate government. So we need to stop inspecting the results, and we need to leave that to the professionals, i.e. us. So everything is in stasis while they confer in their chambers and do whatever obscene Masonic rituals they need to in order to get 5 votes together. They emerge from their temple on the 12th.
But before you reach the conclusion, I just want to ask, did they have to fast track this? Because obviously they have like a huge docket of things that they're looking at. And so is there some sort of procedure that allows them to like reprioritize things under what circumstances?
Yeah, you so whenever you file for an appeal or a direct case where they have original jurisdiction to any court, really, you file something with the clerk of the court, and you can say, hey, this is an emergency, you need to consider this. And they're under no obligation to do that.
So it's just up to their discretion if they decide it's important, basically. Okay.
Yeah. And most courts can just elect not to hear so the Supreme Court basically chooses its cases. There's nothing that mandates that they hear any appellate case. I'm not sure what the rule is off the top of my head about cases where they have original jurisdiction, but that's mostly just state versus state conflicts. Lower courts, the rules get more complicated depending on what you're talking about. But basically, the Supreme Court does what they want because they have this ethos of being the final deciders. That, oh my God, once I have a Supreme Court decision, that's the end of the matter, which is quite a trick to end up with everybody sort of agreeing that you're in charge despite having effectively zero concrete power. Like, they don't have control over any forces. They have no ability to tax. They have no access to money. All that they have is their own sort of existence as a mutually agreed arbiter, but they can't actually do anything if somebody decides to stop them and can make it stick. So on December 12th, they issue the infamous Bush versus Gore decision, which finally orders an end to the recount, and it's basically, okay, everybody stop your timers. The count is the count. Wherein Bush is ahead by 537 votes. Immediately, Katherine Harris certifies the election, and it's essentially a done deal. They issue this opinion unsigned, which is extremely rare. Usually when the Supreme Court issues a decision, they sort of issue it as, this is the opinion of the court written by Clarence Thomas or whoever, joined by these other people, and here are the dissenters. The per curiam opinions are usually kind of like procedural opinions, or things where it's extremely clear, it's almost not worth their time. Nobody even wants to claim the credit. Probably some clerk wrote it. But this is a major case, like the most major case probably of that year, and they can't bother to put their name to it, which some would take as an indication of shame or kind of a deflection of responsibility. The dissenters, on the other hand, do sign their opinion, and instead of closing with the traditional kind of collegial, for the reasons given above, I respectfully dissent, they just end it, I dissent. So
when they're in their chambers, and I would imagine they're not allowed to be disturbed by external influences officially, but I got to imagine informally everybody tries to influence their decision making. Do you know in this case who and how they went about trying to get the votes to go their way?
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't do it kind of personal. That would be, the risk of doing that would be immense. I mean, if you were doing it, you would go through their clerks, since the clerks actually do most of the writing for most of the justices. They do most of the research. They're kind of like, miniature prime ministers almost. But most of what they're doing, there's a couple of books written by ex-Supreme Court clerks, and a couple more written by justices that sort of describe the decision-making process when they were on the court. And usually it's kind of like there's a straw poll of who's leaning which way. The clerks kind of bang out some rationales that everybody can agree on. They do another straw poll. They select somebody to actually write the opinion. And then his clerks write up the opinion, and everyone signs their name. That's kind of the broad sketch of how it usually works.
So there's no informal lobbying, basically, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, none that I've heard of. Certainly none in this case. That would have been a major scandal had that happened.
Right.
I mean, it's the whole priest thing again. Like, you would think that, these are sort of independent political actors. Like, they're a branch of government. Like, they're politicians. And, you would think that you would want to kind of bring things to their attention the same way that everybody agrees it's totally okie dokie to talk to a congressman before a vote, or talk to a president before they issue some decision. But there's these layers of ceremony that are supposed to replicate, again, this idea that you're talking with the spirit of the Constitution. Like, don't interrupt me. I'm communing with the gods. Like, they're going to send the lightning.
Right.
If you don't show the proper deference.
Like jurisprudence is being guided by the Holy Spirit. And,
exactly.
And our common law is just the work of the grand Masonic architect, or whatever demon is acting through these people, I guess.
Yeah. Almost certainly demon. I'm just going to throw that out.
What's interesting is that they've asked Antonin Scalia, rest in peace, who died, I think, 2 years ago now, kind of surreptitiously, and
mysteriously died on his ranch.
with a pillow.
No, it was a
over
hunting
his
lodge.
head.
He died at a
Yeah, it wasn't
Masonic
his.
hunting lodge.
Yeah.
But they asked him over the years many different times what he thought of his decision, and he never gave some kind of dumb metaphysical answer. He's given a lot of answers. Most of them revolved around this idea of, well, the Democrats are effectively arguing, or it was David Bowie's for the Democrats was effectively arguing that.
Famously representing the U.S. government also against Microsoft during the antitrust trial.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
But he argued, I guess he was arguing that this thing shouldn't even be part of the Supreme Court, that the Florida Supreme Court had already given their decision, and they should go back to recounting, that this was effectively an issue of states' rights. The Democrats love to kind of trot out states' rights, very opportune times, but then undermine as much as they can at the legislative level. But Antonin Scalia said, well, he was essentially arguing that we had no say, but the fundamental question is, do you get to keep recounting until you get the results you like? And you can't just decide to recount a new way just because you didn't like the results of the previous way that you counted. And that's why he voted the way he did. It wasn't like metaphysical. It was essentially saying like they're just trying to game the system n number of times until they receive their desired results. And Donna Brazile admitted to that.
Which would have been a good rationale as far as I'm concerned. Like,
yeah.
The actual rationale that they gave was pretty goddamn bad. Like, the fact that they couldn't sign their own name to it was bad enough of an indication. Yeah. But the substance of their argument was a selective recount was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, which is like, in American jurisprudence, whenever somebody trots out the 14th Amendment, they're trying to screw you. Like, it doesn't matter about the context. Somebody's getting shafted, because the 14th Amendment in modern American jurisprudence means the government should be fair. It's like, okay, well, that's something a 2-year-old would say. Like, what does that mean in practice? And the answer is whatever they want it to mean. Right.
I mean, the idea that the government should be fair, if that's the crux of it, is sort of undermined by the fact that this was a totally partisan decision, because SCOTUS was 5 GOP, 4 Democrat at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea that they're like this impartial priestly class is even then just kind of bizarre, because you can break it down that it's just partisanship.
And it's even worse than that, because like they're saying that it violates the idea, or the concrete language in the 14th Amendment, that no state should that states are mandated to ensure to their citizens, quote unquote, equal protection of the laws. So in context of being enacted after the Civil War, that means you don't get to have a racial aristocracy, a racial caste system. You're all citizens. You don't get to make a distinction in your laws between like, oh, this guy is an African and so he can't testify against a white man. Like, that's the sort of thing it was meant to abolish. In this circumstance, they interpret it to mean that if you have different ballot, or if you have the same ballots potentially counted in different ways in different counties, that this is a violation of the protection of laws. Well, so this is obvious bullshit, because it's set up to be a county by county system. That's how it's been for literally 250 years. That elections are run on a county system. They have different voting machines. They have different literal people counting the votes. So of course you're going to have some differences in outcomes, and nobody over the course of 250 years thought that it was a problem. And in fact, the Supreme Court doesn't actually think it's a problem, because the most damning part of the entire decision is that they give this whole legal rationale for why counting a vote differently in 2 different places is an intolerable infringement on the rights of Americans. But this principle is limited, quote, to the present circumstance.
Right.
So in other words, like, don't try to use my own logic against me.
Yeah.
4 years from now, when you have a Republican that's losing and you're trying to flip the election in the other way and you want to do the same thing. No. Present circumstances only, buddy. Or when some Democratic attorney is suing to invalidate the results of the entire Texas election because we have a bunch of different counties and these use optical scans and these use punch cards. And the whole thing is completely different. No, can't do that. Present circumstances.
Right. It's ridiculous because there's never going to be any sort of regularity in methodology or technology or just kind of people doing this sort of clerical work in counting elections across the United States. It is inevitably, no matter what, going to work differently in Juneau, Alaska than it does in Tallahassee, Florida. It just is.
Right.
And they had to have known that. Like, yeah, we can't make this permanent. We can't make this permanent jurisprudence because the ramifications only in 4 years' time for the next big election is it's like way too much work to be done. Probably impossible.
Right. And
which sets you up for another constitutional crisis every 4 years.
So they say that because the 4-county manual recount has been deemed unconstitutional, and because there's just, golly, look at the time, there's not enough time for a full statewide recount at this point, with 3 or so days to go until the constitutional deadline. We can't do a full statewide recount. That would be silly at this point. So we're going to say, okay, game over. We stop the clock. We look at the score. Bush is ahead. We certify. Now, the cool thing is, everybody focuses on the Supreme Court because that's the easy thing to focus on. On the same day that Bush versus Gore is issued, the Florida legislature meets and votes, as they are entitled to under the U.S. Constitution, to award their electoral votes to Bush by fiat. So the Constitution says states can set up their own systems for choosing electors. You can do it like Maine or Nebraska does, where it's district by district with special bonus votes. You can do a winner takes all. You can just have the Florida legislature vote and say Bush wins. End of story. We didn't even need to vote, turns out. So not only is the Supreme Court ruling terrible and disingenuous and so shaming that they won't even put their own name to it, it's also completely unnecessary because they could have avoided the entire circumstance by allowing the Florida legislature to assume their own responsibilities.
Yeah.
Wasn't it the stay that was issued, I think, by the Supreme Court that ultimately cost Gore a positive outcome, if it was ever possible for him? Because they were in the process of recounting, and essentially they just had to stop because the Supreme Court now was reviewing the situation. And then they missed this deadline that allowed them to submit the results of the recount.
Yeah, I mean, it's questionable if they would have had enough time. It's possible that if first
the possibility was eliminated, is what I'm saying. So that's
right.
the claim.
I mean, it's questionable whether it was ever possible, but yeah, I mean, there was an obvious 1-2 punch where they call a timeout, they leave the clock running, and then they complain that, oh shoot, like the game is over. It's possible that if Gore initially, like if the first thing that he did was demand a statewide recount, instead of trying to sort of efficiently pad his total, there have been a couple of independent studies where they actually got the physical ballots and they looked at them and they did various sorts of methodologies, and when these couple of independent organizations did the counts, they came up with Gore winning by about 100 votes in a statewide recount. Now, that's questionable. I mean, you have to wonder, now you're talking about like a 0.009% error rate or so shifts the election. So, I mean, how credible is that really? Who are these organizations? It's possible that you could have swung it, but by the time the Florida Supreme Court actually ruled on December 8th, I believe, that there needed to be full statewide recount, there probably wasn't even time at that point.
Well, let me ask you this. It's more philosophy than legal. If Bush or Gore won by one vote, that would be the minimum to show, preference, right? Would you say that that's valid?
I mean, valid means different things. Like, I'm not a huge fan of democracy. In my view, if you win by one vote, that means, like, nothing. That might as well at that point have won a coin toss.
Mm-hmm.
The notion that, my God, like, this person is illegitimate, like, the only thing that makes somebody illegitimate is if people aren't following their orders. That's the sine qua non of illegitimacy. It's pure power. So, I mean, I don't really have a dog in the fight of who has kind of fundamental democratic legitimacy. I don't believe that you get legitimacy from winning an election. I believe you get legitimacy by being legitimated by other powerful actors accepting your, which, is ultimately what happened with Bush. So the day after the ruling, Al Gore makes this kind of poncy and pompous concession speech about the virtues of our democracy and how we have to accept this result, blah, blah, blah. And Bush is ultimately instated as the meandering thief man.
Yeah.
And it's surprising. So at the time, The Onion wrote a pretty great story about the Florida descending into chaos as Bill Clinton calls out the army and declares martial law, and roving packs of Republican operatives get into guerrilla street battles with Democratic operatives, basically painting a hilariously exaggerated picture of Banana Republic style quasi-coup chaotic election non-result. And the funny thing is that nobody ever expected this to happen. Like, nobody anticipated, like, well, shit, what if Gore doesn't concede? Like, what if like Gore literally says, no, I'm president. Everybody who's in the army who supports me, like, rally to my banner and we march on DC. That was never a possibility, which I don't know is the case at this moment.
Yeah, that could have very well happened if Trump refused to concede the election in 2016. He was kind of hinting at that. Remember, people were making very convincing memes and montages of, like, Civil War II, and it always started with him saying, "I'll let you know at the time," when he was being asked if he would question the legitimacy of the presidency, and it was certainly starting to feel like that. Like, Trump could, or anyone could, summon, like, a guerrilla army of actual military and their supporters to try and seize the presidency. The way things are going now, like, the United States was not nearly as divided ideologically in 2000 as it is only 17 years later.
I have a sort of a question that may surprise you guys, but it was, even then, I always kind of wondered, why can't either side just contest the election? I mean, they could always make these claims. It's sort of maybe in the sort of thinking of Scalia in this, but you could always just say, well, there was fraud, there was error, somebody did something wrong, and then you can keep going until you get the result that you're looking for. Mm-hmm. I guess in the case where it's sort of a landslide, it's harder to make that argument. But I'm wondering what mechanisms hold the losing side from taking that strategy more often, because we've never really seen it until this, at least to this extent.
If you decide to start a civil war, then you're in a civil war. So if you...
But over an election, I mean, that we've never seen this before, right?
There's a difference between like going through the courts, where you're still kind of putting on this pantomime of participating in the legitimate institutions of the system and sort of conforming to the conventions of the existing regime. If the question is, why don't you always sue? I mean, my guess would be it diminishes your paychecks in the future. Like most elections, again, are kind of pantomime. And you have...
Whose paychecks? The candidates or the...
the candidate and their staff.
The staff, I can get that, but the candidate would be willing, but maybe the staff wouldn't. That's what you're saying.
I mean, Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton did just fine over their years out of power. Presumably, Obama is going to do just fine.
Other than Viagra ads, how well did Bob Dole do? I mean, the loser usually, doesn't get much. And your example was basically the Clintons had already won, and so they were just kind of famous and known
like
for
what
their
happened to
success.
Walter Mondale?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, if that's your future, I mean, Al Gore made a climate change movie, I guess, but it's like, why not just go for broke? Is kind of my question.
Well, there's a huge difference between filing some court cases and going for broke, so to speak. Like, you can only, if you're like, no, I don't concede the election, we march on DC tomorrow, then you either become president or you die.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying doing it through the courts is really what I'm asking.
Yeah. I mean, if you do it through the courts, I mean, you need something that's plausible that you can win. Yeah. Otherwise, you just diminish your future book sales. Your staffers who are along for the rides can't get good jobs because they're associated with a shit show.
I guess it comes down to if you think you can actually win in court. And then,
and I mean, in situations where candidates can win, like we've had a number of disputed senatorial and representative elections over the years where there have been various permutations of recounts. In the Minnesota situation that I had mentioned earlier.
So how come the guy whoever ran against Al Franken didn't contest that? I mean, that's a perfect example.
Coleman, he did.
Okay.
Yeah, he went through the courts. Their courts ultimately weren't favorable enough to him. Between the courts and the county officials, again, who are sort of managing the recounts.
And the press. I mean, the press plays kind of a feedback loop aspect in both the 2000 recount and in most of these recount dramas, and especially in the Franken one.
Yeah, I mean, it's the stakes often for the losing side in politics in the U.S. aren't actually that high. It's a lot of good. And I think as you see the stakes get higher and higher, I mean, there's kind of there's a limited salient where it's worthwhile to go into the courts and roll the dice on court decisions that might or might not go your way for all the good it'll do you. But I mean, if you're having to contest things regularly to begin with, you're probably in a situation where the courts aren't really reliable or on your side. And, now you start having to look into alternate political arrangements.